Well, a superconducting magnet is like an ordinary electromagnet, copper wire wound around an iron core, except instead of copper wire, it's a superconducting wire, which means it carries electricity without loss. So that means you can put a lot more electricity through it than you can through a copper wire, very high, let's say, current density and therefore energy density, and you can produce much higher fields with a superconducting magnet than you can with an ordinary magnet. A very clever idea and a very promising idea, but one that has not yet been developed, is to store energy in the magnetic field of a magnet or a superconducting magnet. That's called superconducting magnetic energy storage, or SMES for short. The idea is simply that if you want to put energy into the field, you run up the current in the magnet. When you're ready to take it out, you run the current down, and the energy is transformed from magnetic energy into electrical energy. So energy storage is one of the major challenges facing the energy system. And it's a challenge on several levels. At the smallest level, you may think about storing energy in batteries. So there's plenty of energy in your car battery to start your car, but not enough energy to really drive it very far. If you disconnected the gasoline engine from a Prius, you'd be able to drive about a mile on the electricity that's stored in the batteries, and that's by far not enough. So we need to make the energy density of batteries higher by a factor of 2 to a factor of 5 to get the driving range without the battery taking up the entire back seat and trunk that most people need just to get to work and back. If you want to use an electric car for a long-range trip, a journey of a few hundred miles, the challenges are even greater, and that vision, although achievable, is farther off, I think, than commuting to work in an electric car. But there are other levels at which we need to store electricity too. So we need to store electricity for the electricity grid. And in the present day, with coal, mostly coal, 50% coal electricity generation, what you want to do is run the coal plant at a constant rate, producing a constant amount of power 24/7. But of course demand isn't constant, so demand is high during the day and very low at night, which means that you have to turn on and off fossil fuel plants to match that demand. It would be nice to be able to store energy that's generated at night when there's excess capacity and use it during the day when there's excess demand. But that is a huge capacity challenge. The batteries that we have nowadays are simply inadequate to that task, and we need to find other ways to do it. The most popular and cheapest way right now is to pump water uphill, remarkably, very simple, a thing that's been around for 100 years. But very effective, an 80% round-trip efficiency. So you don't lose much energy when you do that. And of course, we know how to do it with hydroelectric plants and with pumps. But not every part of the country has the hills, the heights that you need to pump water uphill. In the Midwest, that would be a challenge, and you have to find something else. So one of the ways in which you can do this is by these superconducting magnetic energy storage devices. So the SMES that we were talking about earlier, on a very large scale, the scale of a football field or more, could store the full day's output of a typical coal-fired electricity generation plant in the magnetic field. The advantages of that, let's say over a battery, apart from size and capacity, are speed. So you can run the field up very quickly when you have excess electricity. So this is one of the things that's coming. But there are lots of other ways in which superconductivity can impact the power system, and especially the grid. For example, in urban areas, most of the power distribution is done underground because people don't like to see power lines overhead. And in fact, power lines underground are much safer, out of the way, out of harm's way, both the weather and just accidents, than those which are above ground. But in urban areas, they're getting saturated. So you can't put any more current through a copper wire that's underground and contained in a conduit. The only solution to get more capacity is to dig more trenches and install more underground cables. If you replace those copper cables with superconducting cables, you can get many times the power density through the same cross-sectional area, a factor of 5, in fact. So if you imagine replacing just simply pulling all the copper wire underground cables out and replacing them with superconductors, you get immediately a factor of 5 increase in capacity. That's enough to handle the growth for decades.